Okay, so I'm gonna real quickly talk about chapter 4, which is ethics and legal issues. And this is a very important chapter. It's relatively short, but it's still a very important chapter talking about information systems and how they relate to ethics and legal issues such as privacy. So speaking of which, we're going to start off with privacy and talk about some of the privacy issues. So we've had a proliferation of information systems in businesses and also in our personal lives. But at the same time, these have created concerns around privacy. So, if I look back, and I'm not that old, but I guess I'm older than probably many of you. When I was growing up, we had the internet, but it was towards the tail end of me growing up. Very few people were on it, and it was used for different purposes than we have today. So in those days, we didn't share every little detail of our lives on the internet. And for good reason. We actually, there's an archive service on the internet that archives pretty much most information on the internet. So what you write today will always be there. And I normally show an example of that. I guess during the Q&A, you can ask me about it, and I can show you an example of an embarrassment of mine that's still out there 20 some years later. Okay, so let's look at privacy issues. We've got email. So we have our personal email, and obviously in a business, we have our corporate email. And so our corporate email is not something that we have an expectation of privacy on. Okay, so in general, our company requires that we complete some sort of employee handbook or acceptable use policy, whatever it might be. But in those policies, they state that email is not private. And in general, the courts have held that corporate email or any type of corporate system that you're provided as part of your job is not something that is protected in terms of privacy. So I specifically expect that maybe someone will read my corporate email. Okay, even if it's not today, eventually someone might read it. Long after I'm gone. So I always conduct myself professionally and don't use it for things other than corporate related matters. Now we go to social networking. This is an area, so email's been around for decades. I had email in college, I had email when I was in high school and things like that, but email's been around a long time. Every organization, for the most part, provides it to their employees. Okay. Social networking, however, is a relatively new invention. So it's only about 15 years old or so to have social networking. Now, social networking, is it something that we have an expectation of privacy on? And there have been a number of different court cases in this regard. And so they're not talked about in the book. I'll just mention very high level about a couple of cases. So, and if you took my business law class, you know what I'm referring to. There's a couple of cases related to this. Okay. So if I use social networking and I take reasonable attempts to lock down my profile, I'm not sharing things publicly, I'm sharing them with my friends, then I do have a reasonable expectation of privacy from my employer being able to access my social networking. Okay. If, however, I post things publicly, I have no expectation of privacy. Okay. I've made that information public. So if it's publicly available, my employer can do whatever they want with it. Okay, so be careful of your pics of you drinking at parties and whatnot. Okay, but if you lock it down, there's an expectation of privacy as long as you properly lock it down. And things always depend in the legal world, but the court cases that I'm referring to, you have a reasonable expectation of privacy from your employer intruding upon social networking if it's locked down, which means that in general, in most states, now some states might be different, but in most states, your employer can't demand that you turn over your social networking passwords, or they can't friend request you with some fake name of a friend from high school or whatever to access your profile. Okay? So keep that in mind. But at the same time, just think about everything that you post on the internet. There's no absolute guarantee of privacy. Systems can get hacked, information can be posted. So I wouldn't post anything you wouldn't want your grandma to see. Okay. The next thing is employee monitoring. So can employers monitor their employees? Okay. And employees obviously see this as a violation of my privacy. Employers believe they have a right to monitor productivity, et cetera. Okay. So you should always assume that you're being monitored. And depending on your job, you might actually be monitored. Other jobs may not be monitored so much. So let's say you're a driver for UPS. You're probably being monitored as you drive throughout your day, okay? If you're working for a big company, some companies actually install software in your computer that monitors what you're doing. So, say right now you're during COVID and you're working at home for the first time, they know that you're actually productive. Now, is that the right approach from a management perspective? I completely disagree with that approach. As a manager, I would never do something like that. I trust my employees, and if I can't trust my employees, then maybe I've got the wrong employees, okay? But there are organizations who do that, so be aware of that. Data collection. So we do have organizations who collect data, and organizations who use that data to actually sell you as the product. So social networks are a good example. You are the product with a social network. So this is why a lot of times organizations will say you cannot do social networking related to the business. Your social networking needs to be specific to you personally if you're going to do it. You cannot talk about our business at all. We have people who are authorized to do social networking on behalf of the business. Okay. Data collection can be used for other purposes as well. So there are credit reporting bureaus who collect data. Okay? So that might impact you from a privacy perspective. There are databases with information that are collected by the government that are covered by the Privacy Act of 1974. And then there are also Fair Credit Reporting Acts and other things like that that govern data collection. Okay? Now, with respect to privacy and the web and networking, first of all, organizations have you do acceptable use policies, that you review them, you sign them, you agree to them. Okay? This is to make sure that you're using company resources appropriately. Now, some companies allow you to use things for personal use to a certain extent. So to give you an example, the company I work for, because of COVID, has said you are all allowed to use your Zoom accounts for personal meetings. So if you want to use your Zoom account to go, do a family reunion or something, which people have done at work, okay? You're allowed to do that. If you want to use your corporate laptop for personal use, we know we're in a pandemic right now, that's okay. Some companies actually, if you're on their network at their office, will have an acceptable use policy where you can't even use the internet fully. So I used to work for a large company. They're not in business anymore. They were acquired, but they had what were called proxies on the internet, and you had to authenticate with a password. So every time you go to a website, they knew what website you were on, how long you spent there, what you were doing, because they could track all that. Okay. If you did too much, you'd be violating their acceptable use policy, and then you'd be subject to disciplinary action. Okay. Another aspect here of privacy is accountability. So who's responsible for what and who's liable for what? So that's another area that's usually called out in your acceptable use policy. And then non-repudiation is a method for binding all the parties to a contract. So you and your employer and whatnot, that's how we bind you to a particular contract. Now, with respect to privacy, there are a number of laws, and I want to be very clear. There is no expectation of privacy at a constitutional level in this country, okay? The closest thing we have is unreasonable searches and seizures and due process. That's the closest to privacy law. But that only affects certain aspects of privacy. It doesn't govern things like your data and things like that, okay? The Constitution was written long before data was even terminology, okay, that was in common use. So what you post on Facebook is not subject to constitutional protections, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the legal side of things, okay? But from a privacy law perspective, I'm going to talk about 5 areas very briefly here that are relevant to probably most of you. First is HIPAA, okay? HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This governs your health-related data, okay? So companies cannot publish or use your HIPAA data without specific permission, including your employer, okay? So your employer has certain things that you are allowed to do, certain things you're not allowed to do. The second area is FACTA. And so FACTA is a Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act, okay? And this is to prevent you from the risk of identity theft. Okay, so it governs how long information can be available, who can have access to your credit information, et cetera. The third area is COPA, and this applies to people under the age of 13, so kids basically. Okay, so if your website, your organization's website targets children under 13, then you must have parental consent. Okay. Now the first three that I mentioned are all federal laws. Okay? These are federal statutes. The next two are, one is specific to California, the last one is specific to the European Union, so it's actually not a US law, but it does impact US-based companies. So don't assume that because you're an entirely US-based operation that the last one doesn't apply to you, okay? That's an incorrect assumption. Let me touch on the first one for California first. So January 1st of this year, we got a really awesome law called the California Consumer Privacy Act. I say awesome, and I mean that partially, but I also mean it a little bit in humorous method, okay? So the CCPA, it goes a long way towards improving privacy, but it was actually weakened before it was written into law by the business lobby, okay? So it's not as powerful as the GDPR, which I'll talk about next, okay? The CCPA, though, does offer us a lot of protections of our privacy. It affects companies who are based in California or any company in the world, well, let's just say the US, let's keep it simple, the US, who deals with consumers in California. Okay? And a consumer can be a private person, it can be a corporation. Okay? But that's what the CCPA applies to. And so it came into effect January 1st. It wasn't enforced by the Attorney General until July 1st of this year. So we were in the third week, roughly, or so of enforcement of this law, okay? The GDPR is the European Union's privacy law. This is a multinational law that applies to all the member countries of the European Union. Okay? It has very strict restrictions on privacy. So in the US, privacy is kind of viewed as your data belongs to the company that you provide it to, it doesn't belong to you. And companies can do whatever they want to monetize it. With the GDPR, that data is owned by the person that data was created by or for. Okay, so I own all of my data. I have absolute control over that data. In order to use my data, companies have to get explicit consent from me. And they can only use it for the purpose for which they obtained consent originally. So they want to use it for providing me a service, and I give them the ability to do that as part of providing the service to me, that's great. But if the company decides later on they want to sell my information to someone else, they have to go back to me and get my approval again, and I can decline. I have the right to have the data maintained to be updated all the time. I have the right to delete the data, a lot of other rights, okay? So this is one of the aspects of the GDPR, and the fines are steep for non-compliance. So the fines can be as much as 4% of your organization's revenues per offense. Okay? So you effectively have 25 offenses like this that do actually get a penalty assessed. Your company's entire revenues for the year could be gone like that. Okay, so it's very critical, and companies do have to take this seriously. Now, I mentioned this is not just for European companies, excuse me. It's for any company that does business with people who are in Europe or provides access to services for people in Europe and collects data, whether or not that's the intent or not. So let's say I have a website and I have a form to collect email, you just send me an email. Unless I explicitly deny access, and not only deny access programmatically so people in Europe can't get into it, but then assuming they can figure out some workaround to get to the forum anyways, I also have to state that I do not want people from the European Union to respond to my form. I don't want their data, you're not allowed to, et cetera, that sort of thing, okay? So that's what I have to do to prevent people in the European Union from using my system in order to avoid. But most companies just end up complying with the GDPR because it's a hell of a lot easier than dealing with these types of issues of what if someone does make it through to do it. Now, this also applies to employment data. So if the your employees are in the European Union, then that applies to them. If you have suppliers in the European Union, you can pretty soon see the slippery slope of where this goes with individuals and corporate relationships. Okay. Right, so next let's talk about email. So email is widely used, but it has a lot of privacy issues. Okay, first of all, email is not encrypted. It's by default, it's not encrypted. Okay, you can encrypt it, but most people don't because it's very difficult to use. Because it's not encrypted, anybody who intercepts that email in transit can read what it says. Okay, so you write a secret note to your classmate and you're on UCR's network, there's a chance someone could read it. Okay, heck, there's a chance that someone on the internet could read it, because it's not, even though you're sending it from campus to someone else, it actually goes out to the internet to Google and then comes back before you see it on the other person's end. So it's possible that someone can read it. It's also possible Google's actually indexing your email with their search, so they know what you're saying as well. Okay. So email encryption is one way of preventing folks from seeing your email content. Now, spam is junk email. It's usually sent for advertising purposes, and there are a number of laws related to spam. But it doesn't matter because the likelihood of you going after a spammer is low, so they know this, so they'll continue sending you mail. They won't stop, okay? So the best you could do is use anti-spam filters to block the email. Okay? In terms of consent, so in order, under the GDPR, and to a lesser extent the CCPA, you have to have consent to use email. Okay? So I have to give explicit consent for a company to be able to use my email address or something. Okay? Other forms of data collection, cookies. Okay? I'm not talking about the cookies that Cookie Monster likes to eat. I'm actually talking about these little pieces of data which sit in a text file on your computer, and every time you go to a website, there are cookies that are collected to help you personalize experience and advertising and a variety of other purposes for the next time you go. Oh, so it remembers what you put in your cart last time when you go back a month later, right? That's what cookies are. Okay? Log files are generated when you go to a website as well. And so companies collect these so that they can troubleshoot problems. If you're doing transactions, they have a whole history of every transaction you've made. These log files enable them to do that. Okay? But they can collect information about you. Now let's move on to ethics. So ethics is doing the right thing, and ethics and legal are different. Okay, so you could be ethical but not legal. You can be illegal but not, or illegal but ethical, or illegal and unethical. Okay, you can also be legal and ethical. So looking at some examples, let's say I go out and buy a copy of Photoshop. I install it on my computer, and then my friend says, "Hey, can I have a copy of that? I don't have the money to buy Photoshop." And I say, sure, I give you a copy to use, okay? That is unethical, and it's actually illegal as well, okay? That's called software piracy. The second thing is, let's say your bank sells the customer's phone numbers to a competitor. It's legal unless something like CCPA applies, okay? But it's unethical. They shouldn't be doing that. Let's say, and this probably happens with a lot of students, okay? Let's say you download Beyonce's latest album from a random internet site. Not her site, some random internet site. That's unethical and it's illegal. And by the way, I have a former classmate of mine from law school who basically makes an awesome living suing people like you who do this sort of thing. Okay? And winning. He drives a Porsche, he lives in Malibu on the coast there. He's doing pretty well going after people who do this. So my recommendation is just don't do it. Okay? You might save 99 cents, but in the long term, you're going to cost you thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Okay? And you say, well, I don't have any assets, but they could still go after your future income. So think about that. All right, the last thing here is you intentionally infect your boss's computer with a virus because it's funny, okay? And you get fired for it. That's legal and it's ethical. Okay. Now let's talk about censorship. So some countries do restrict access to the web, okay? And some examples are China, Burma, Singapore, et cetera, okay? They provide restricted access to the web. Now, for everywhere else, and let's just kind of put that aside, the whole restrict access for countries, because we don't live in one of those countries, okay, yet. But we have two types of information on the web. We have private information and public information. So private information is not subject to censoring, okay, by government entities. And the reason for that is the First Amendment gives us the free speech right with respect to public entities, basically government entities, Congress, president, states, local governments, etc. But we want to be very careful to qualify that as government entities. We do not have free speech rights when it comes to private entities, okay? None of us have a free speech right, and if Facebook refused to allow us to say something, they are not violating our First Amendment rights, okay? Our First Amendment rights, all of our civil rights only apply to government actions. It's a common misconception. It's repeated all the time. Hell, even my own dad doesn't understand this, okay? It's government entities cannot censor you, but private entities can, okay? So if Facebook wants to censor me and prevent me from saying something, they can do so. Okay, they can remove my post. It just happened yesterday with some videos of false information. Okay, they have the right to do that. They can censor it, and usually they set themselves up to do this with terms of service or policies. But again, you don't have a right to free speech or anything else in our Bill of Rights except through government actions. Okay, so Facebook, AT&T, Verizon, whoever can do whatever they want in terms of censorship, okay? Now, we won't get into this class, but if you did take business law, you know there's an exception to that when they're an internet service provider. As long as they don't censor content, they're not legally liable if someone sues them. So there's a reason to not censor if you're an internet service provider, right? Because you get some protections. Now, public information posted by an organization can be censored. So let's say the government posts something publicly, they can censor that information to avoid potentially offending someone, okay? Now let's talk about intellectual property, and then we'll be almost done with this chapter. So intellectual property falls into 4 areas. We have copyrights, trademarks, patents, and trade secrets. Copyrights are things like the textbook, okay? The copyright is held by, I would imagine, the publisher and the authors here. Okay? So it looks like the copyright of this book, it's been assigned to Cengage Learning. Okay? All rights reserved. So you cannot reproduce this document. Okay? Now, there's a thing called fair use, allows you to use a very limited portion for academic purposes. So if, say, you buy the 8th edition of the book and I have the 9th edition and there's something that's not in the 8th edition, I can do up to 1 chapter and produce it for students, okay, under the fair use provision for professors. Okay. Fair use doesn't apply to other areas though, other than education, okay? So you can't use it for your, you can't go get a book off the shelf, copy a chapter of it and call it fair use for your own personal use, okay? It's not fair use. Trademarks. Trademarks are things like the McDonald's logo, the HP logo. These are things that dress the trade. They're recognizable, and they're something that we can protect as intellectual property. They have some sort of tangible value to us. Okay? Patents are inventions, and there are different types of patents. Okay? The most common being a patent here that a utility patent, which allows us to invent something that we can then file a patent for. But we also have design patents like the iPhone rounded icons and that display, the way that it displays on the screen, that's a design patent, okay? There are also plant patents. So UCR actually has plant patents on disease-resistant citrus trees that they invented on the campus. And every time a farmer plants one of those, they pay a royalty as part of the cost of purchasing the seeds or the seedling or whatever it might be, okay? And then we have trade secrets. Trade secrets are a little unique. You don't actually have to do anything other than protect the information. How do we protect that as an organization? We use non-disclosure agreements, okay? We protect trade secrets, so the Coca-Cola formula, the KFC 11 herbs and spices, that sort of thing is a trade secret, okay? And there are penalties for employees who go and share those or other people who share them when they're trade secret, And then the last area that I'll talk about today is telecommuting, which is very popular right now. Okay? Information systems have allowed telecommuting to happen. Interesting conversation a few months ago when COVID first started hitting. If you think about it, if this had happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago even, I don't think the world would have survived, right? Because we don't have the ability to do telecommuting back then. Very few people were able to do it. So the economy probably would have even gone further down the toilet because nobody would have been able to work. Okay? So telecommuting has really, really enabled us to have a kind of a business continuity plan, so to speak, for the economy and for everything else. Now, I know that not everybody can work from home. I get that, okay? But telecommuting does allow a large portion of people who work in offices to work from home, okay? And so there's a lot of benefits associated with it. Now, some of these don't apply to all companies. Some companies expect that if you're at home, you're 100% focused on the job and you're not to have your kids and family members around, okay? I work for a company that is understanding and friendly to the families and stuff like that, so that's not an issue. But there are companies who say, if you're working from home, you're going to sit in front of your computer, your kids aren't going to bug you, you can't be watching your kids at the same time. Okay? There's been a little bit of adjustment because of COVID, but generally speaking, that's how a lot of companies are. But a benefit is, if your company does allow it, you could care for your children or spend more time with your family. Okay? You can save on clothing. You don't have to dress up necessarily. Okay? There's the joke of the news anchors who have just nice clothes on the top, but they're wearing their sweatpants on the bottom, right? You don't have to commute, so you save time. This is a huge win for companies, by the way. If you think about it, people come in to the office at 8 and they leave at 5 o'clock, right? And they take an hour for lunch or whatever. Most people no longer take an hour for lunch because if you're salaried and you don't fit in, basically if you're an exempt employee, you don't have to take a lunch. You can basically work through lunch. Okay? If you're non-exempt or hourly, you have to take a lunch. It's required. Okay? So if you don't have to take that hour for lunch, you're working another hour potentially. And if I don't have to commute on either end, I might be willing to work a little extra. So companies can get more time out of people if they're not driving. We also have fewer people on the roads, which reduces emissions, which improves the environment. We end up with lower costs because people aren't having to pay for gas and the commuting costs, their insurance costs go down. They get that time back. People are happy about that. Maybe it's a more pleasant surrounding. I can guarantee you my home office is a hell of a lot nicer than all but one office I've had in an office facility. Okay? We might be more productive. Frankly, I'm more productive when I've got my dog around me. Okay? When I can listen to music at my own volume and crank it up. Okay? I like to crank my music up, okay, when I'm working. There could be less crime because people are home during the day. Most of the people in my neighborhood have always worked from home, myself included. I've been in an office a few times in my career, but mostly I've worked from home for the last 15 years. If you're disabled, it can be easier for you to work because you don't have to worry about barriers in the workplace. Companies can save on office space and utilities. We can reduce employee absenteeism. If I'm sick, chances are I'm going to continue working unless I'm really sick. Okay? I will probably end up working at least part of the day, so I'm a bit more productive than if I had to take a sick day. Okay? And I can hire people no matter where they're at. So from both a cost perspective and a finding very specialized skill sets, I can hire people anywhere I want. So as a good example, my best performing engineer came from Wichita, Kansas. Okay? Think about that. We weren't recruiting in Wichita, Kansas. Nobody that I know of has an office in Wichita, Kansas. If we hadn't allowed telecommuting, we wouldn't have had that person. Okay? We were able to get them at a lot less money than a person in San Diego. And we were able to find someone with the specific skill sets that we needed. And we didn't have to pay for relocation. And then the last area here is coworkers. Okay? Fewer interruptions from coworkers. Water cooler chats, I get it. They're necessary for some people. Okay? But you can have those with things like Microsoft Teams, Slack, etc. You can get that water cooler chat. I have those all day long, but they're not intrusive. So if I'm busy doing something, I don't have someone coming up to me. We have asynchronous conversations. Okay? So I don't need to have a face-to-face synchronous conversation with someone. I can actually just have a conversation asynchronously at my own leisure. So to give you an example, I wanted to make lobster rolls this weekend. Back when COVID hit, the only thing I could find was lobster tails. And so I got some cheap lobster tails, threw them in the freezer, and now it's about time I need to use them up, okay? So I want to make some lobster rolls, but I don't know how to make a lobster roll. I'm not from Boston or Maine or anything like that. So I post in our Slack channel for food. And I say, hey, does anybody have a recipe for lobster rolls? I want to make a lobster roll this weekend, okay? And now I get an engaging conversation. We all start talking about different recipes, and you know, you get the people from Maine who feel very strongly that it's just, you know, just mayo and the lobster, and you get people from Connecticut who say it's all about the warm butter and nothing else. You get these interesting conversations happening, which spawns other collaboration, builds relationships with your coworkers. You can do that just as easily when you're telecommuting. Okay. And then one other area that's not in the book that is a benefit with telecommuting, can also be a drawback, I suppose, on the interaction side, is these days technology allows us to have things like virtual whiteboards where we can all collaborate in real time. So as an example, last Thursday, we had a strategy looking out 10 years into the future, okay, within the team that I work on. And we each broke into an area of interest for us, and we did this exercise together. We are all distributed around the globe. Okay? We have people as far away as Australia and Europe, okay? Opposite sides of the globe. It would be extremely difficult to get us all together in a synchronous conversation, okay? So we have these asynchronous tools. The one we used was Whimsical, okay? And that allowed us to do collaboration as a group on brainstorming. Okay? And we could do it synchronously for those of us who were able to be on the call, and asynchronously for those who wanted to contribute who were in an opposite time zone. Okay? It actually builds better collaboration. The trick is you have to understand information systems. You have to get comfortable with them, which is the purpose of this class. Okay? By the time you finish this class, you should be very comfortable using information systems, okay? And to date, I haven't had anybody that I'm aware of who walks out of the class and didn't learn something and didn't learn to be more productive with information systems, okay? Now, getting back to telecommuting, drawbacks. If there are no boundaries between work and home, you can become a workaholic. So in my case, I have a room in my house that is my office. Okay. I work in here, I teach in here, I don't spend any other time in here. Okay. Now, not everybody has that luxury, but I have the fortunate circumstance of having this tiny little room off my living room that is too small to be a bedroom and not big enough to be any type of other functional community space. So it's perfect for a little office. Regulated work routine. When you go into an office, you have a work routine. And you go in at 8, you leave at 5, whatever. If you're working remotely, you may not have that sort of thing. Now, the book says less interaction with coworkers. So yes, there is less physical face-to-face interaction, but a lot of companies without COVID bring their teams together. And so that's what my company does. In fact, some of you were in my class. Actually, none of you in this class were in that class. Take that back. Back in February, I had to go do a trip during the spring quarter. Okay, winter, whenever that was. And I had to go out and do an all hands meeting in Atlanta. Okay. Everybody in the company from around the world came together in Atlanta for 4 days, and we met each other, we had meetings, we talked about strategy, and we learned about our products, and we moved forward. Okay. So that's one example. But also smaller teams tend to get together. Okay, so my team, when COVID's over, is planning to get together probably and go do wine tasting or something. Okay. Then we already talked about no separation between work and home life. But there could be things like legal issues about worker injuries. It really doesn't apply if you're just a desk worker, though. You could have family interruptions, household distractions. Okay. I remember a story of an HP employee who was on a call, didn't realize they weren't on mute, and was in the bathroom. Another employee who was washing the dishes or doing laundry or something. I mean, use your own common sense here. You know, you've got a job to do. If you're based on, you know, accomplishments as opposed to hours you spend during the day, what does it really matter? But it's really a management discussion of how you manage your people who are remote. Another drawback is, do you have the right supplies or equipment? And so a lot of people who are forced into this, they don't have the right equipment to be successful at working in an office or working at home, right? They don't have the right equipment. But if you have the right equipment, that's no longer a drawback. And so a lot of organizations are making sure that people have the right equipment. Okay? Now, in normal circumstances without COVID, you can create a two-tiered workforce, telecommuters and on-site workers, that affects promotions and raises. This really does happen, actually, okay? So I worked for Oracle, and I was laid off because I worked remotely. Not because any poor job on my part in terms of performance. I had a stellar performance rating. I had just been granted a ton of stock right before I left, a couple of months before. But the edict came down from the executives that they needed to cut people, and the person I worked for was not used to managing remote people. And so everybody who was remote on his team, he let go because it was harder for him to manage them. Okay? Also, when you're based at headquarters, you're more likely to get promotions and raises. I found that I got raises, I got lots of stock while I was there. It was equal until I changed managers. So when you got to think about it from a manager perspective. That happens a lot with certain managers. The company that I work for today doesn't have a two-tiered workforce. 85% work remotely full-time. The other 15% work part-time remotely with flexibility, and then sometimes go to the office. And we only have one office in the whole world. So we don't have a two-tiered workforce. All right. And I didn't put this in the slides, but green computing. So this is something that organizations are doing to combat climate change. Okay? So they're really focusing on green ways of doing computing. So they're going after LEED certifications and things like that for their facilities. Okay, so that's it for this chapter, and I will post the lecture as soon as possible, and then I'll do chapter 5 as well.